During the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire had entered a period of serious decline and became known as the sick man of Europe. Particularly, the empire started facing extreme financial difficulties. Taxes and spoils of war had always been the two most determining factors of the Ottoman economy. However, after the state stopped achieving victories on the battlefield, there were no spoils of war, and after Bartolomé Dias discovered the Cape of Good Hope at the west coast of Africa in 1487, the path between Europe and India was no longer the Mediterranean Sea, which was in Ottoman control. Meaning, the Ottomans no longer had the luxury of taxing countless ships passing through their domain. After losing access to their main ways of income, the Ottomans began taking internal loans. Then, during Sultan Abdul-Majid's reign, they began taking external loans. Then came a man named Sultan Abdül-Aziz. He realized something. The state had no funds, no government banks, no factories, no manufacturing. The state was fully dependent on Europe. He wanted to make the state independent. However, he knew it could never happen without cutting off connections with Europe. And so, he planned for the state to operate locally and nationally, without external interference from Europe. His ideas of heading towards production instead of consumption and operating independently made him the unwanted man of Europe. Europe wanted to reduce the power of the Caliph by bringing forth Constitutional Monarchy. However, the Sultan did not submit to the Western imperialists, and so headlines spread all throughout Europe, accusing him of being a thief, a dictator, a tyrant, and so on. Over time, his people no longer supported him. He was deposed and sent to Farai Palace, where he'd be martyred. Since the Sultan was a large, strong man, 3 wrestlers were appointed to assassinate him, and so, under the disguise of suicide, they cut both of his wrists until he bled to death, though, in the forensic report it was claimed to have been suicide. Ambitious statesmen who had been persuaded by foreign states had become so effective in the state order that they could now jeopardize the life of a sultan and take the throne of the next. The next person they'd put on the throne would be Sultan Murad, a 33rd degree Mason, and in fact, even his own family knew about his masonry. He fulfilled every order of the great European states, though Sultan Murad was so disturbed by his uncle's murder that he lost his mental faculties. In fact, due to his worrisome behavior, he was not even exposed to the sword-girding ceremony, which had been the spiritual submittal tradition of the caliphate for centuries. Sultan Murad became ill 1 week after his accession. Murad's mental illness gradually worsened until it was impossible for him to remain on the throne, and so he was dethroned only 3 months after his accession due to his illness, which doctors had no cure for. As the course of divinity would have it, contrary to the plans of those who wanted to seize the administration of the state, Shahzada Abdul-Hamid II, the other crown prince, would ascend the throne. Before continuing on with the story, we must take a look at Abdul-Hamid II's upbringing. Abdul-Hamid II was born as the son of Sultan Majid. His mother died when he was only 11 years old, and when he turned 18, his father Abdul-Majid Khan also passed away. His uncle Abdul-Aziz would then ascend to the throne, and because his children were too young, the 2 sons of Sultan Abdul-Majid would become crown princes. Abdul-Hamid and his brother Murad Effendi received a great education at the palace, taught by the most renowned names in their fields. They learned multiple languages and served other skills. Abdul-Hamid II was also well taught in Islamic law and hadith, as well as Ottoman history. His respect for science and scientists was enormous. He would follow the local and foreign press closely during his princedom and reign. Shahzada Abdul-Hamid, an amazing calligrapher and carpenter, was involved in trade since his princedom. He had a carpenter's workshop and farms, and even experience in operating mines. In the future, he would use his private assets generously in the service of the state when necessary. Prince Abdul-Hamid was distinguished by his intelligence and extremely strong memory. His political ability, moderate and frugal behavior attracted the attention of his uncle, Sultan Abdul-Aziz. In fact, Sultan Abdul-Aziz mobilized all means for his bringing. Sultan Abdul-Aziz's taking the young prince with him on his travels to Egypt and Europe would make a significant contribution in the raising of the most powerful last sultan of the Ottoman Empire. During his trip to Europe, Abdul-Hamid, along with his uncle Sultan Abdul-Aziz, went to 8 countries and met 5 rulers. Abdul-Hamid saw many presidents, diplomats, administrative centers, palaces, and pavilions on his trip to Egypt and Europe. He attended fairs, meetings, museums, and even had the opportunity to explore the different military orders, weapons, technologies, and developments of different countries. Thus, he found ideas for future developments and projects, widening his horizon. Here is where we resume our story. When it was decided that Abdul-Hamid should be put on the throne, There was also a second view among the statesmen of the Ottoman administration. The Grand Vizier Midhat Pasha and some of his supporters wanted Murad to remain on the throne, with Abdul-Hamid serving as a prince regent. This was because Sultan Abdul-Aziz had already been deposed by a coup, and the termination of a second sultan in such a short amount of time could have led to bad repercussions. Furthermore, the ambitious statesmen knew that they would more than likely be able to dominate the rule of a prince regent without full power. Prince Abdul-Hamid did not accept this offer. He wanted the state to be represented by a real sultan, and so he met with Sadrazam Rusdu Pasha and Midhat Pasha and made some promises to them. Most importantly, he supported the declaration of the Constitutional Monarchy. Thus, it was agreed to replace Murad with his brother, Abdul-Hamid II, as the next Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The corrupt and ambitious statesmen who were working for Europe managed to remove the power of the caliphate with a document known as the Constitution, explaining what the role and job of the Sultan was in relation to society and in relation to the Sharia. However, this became very controversial because the Quran clearly said to obey Allah, obey the Messenger, and those in authority from among you. However, they were putting the Caliph under the constitution and minimizing his power and capability, contradicting the Quran. Although Sultan Abdul-Hamid had no issue with the constitution, he believed that people weren't ready for it. One of the biggest issues with it was the question as to whether non-Muslims should be in the parliament and the amount of power that they should be able to exercise. And so the decision was made that due to the vast population of non-Muslims within the empire, they should be allowed to represent their communities in every post except for that of the Caliph, the Shaykh al-Islam, and the commander of the army. The outcome would not be so fruitful, however. In his very first days on the throne, the Sultan began cutting down on the palace expenses and appointing honest and competent people to work, though he had to deal with the ongoing rebellion of the Serbs and Montenegrins, whom had been provoked by Russia. Crete, too, was at its peak of unrest. However, as the Ottoman army gained significant successes, just as they were going to enter Belgrade, the big states intervened and a ceasefire was drawn. However, Russia would still continue to wave the banner of Turkophobia and Slavism. Therefore, Midhat Pasha and those around him thought that a few concessions made in the Balkans would curb these feelings. According to Midhat Pasha, the charges against the Ottoman state would be remedied by the constitution and by Europe's intervention. With these thoughts, the Pasha worked for European states on the condition that the constitution would immobilize Russia. Midhat Pasha and his followers pushed for war with Russia, thinking that Europe would support them due to the constitution. However, in reality, the big states would be less interested in the constitution and offered no backing to the Ottoman state. Sultan Abdul-Hamid did not like the way the state was headed. He wanted to stop the war. However, his statesmen refused to comply. The chances of the weak Ottoman state defeating Russia all alone seemed more than unlikely. Abdul-Hamid Han was unable to dominate the administration. The ministers were trying to turn him into a state representative sitting in his palace, while they dragged the state into an abyss. In some decisions, the Sultan's opinion was not even sought. During these works, the new Sultan got to know his statesmen better. Midhat Pasha had started acting like a dictator and did not refrain from disrespecting the Sultan. In fact, he even established an army for himself under the title of nation soldiers. Those who volunteered for his army created unrest in Istanbul and demonstrated in favor of him in the streets. And so, on February 5, 1877, he was invited to the palace and stripped of his Grand Viziership. The Sultan rightfully exiled him using an article of the constitution that the Pasha himself insisted to be included. 3 months after the proclamation of the constitutional law in 1877, the First Ottoman Assembly was opened. It consisted of 120 deputies and 26 dignitaries. Of the deputies, nearly half were non-Muslim, and the ones that were Muslim belonged to many different ethnic elements. It was a parliament where the Turks made up a very small percentage. Most of the people in parliament had a non-Muslim and racist mentality. Some of them did not even speak Turkish. Before long, voices started to emerge against the state and the country in parliament. Members of different religions and races demanded concessions in the name of the masses they represented, proposing that their language is accepted as the official language. In fact, some of them even sought independence. While peace was made with Serbia, the rebellion in Montenegro and the turmoil in Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Crete were not over. The big states tried to intervene. However, the Ottoman state did not accept their harsh protocol. In 1877, the Russian state then declared war against the Ottoman Empire. When the news arrived in Istanbul, Sultan Abdul-Hamid, who was strictly opposed to war, ordered the European states to intervene and initiate peace. However, Midhat Pasha had previously conditioned the people and the state dignitaries to war, and made war with Russia inevitable. By the time the Russians' declaration of war had arrived at the palace, the Tsar's armies had already started attacking the homeland and the borders of Anatolia. This war would be called the War of 93 because it coincided with the Julian calendar year 1293 and would last 9 months until the Edirne armistice. The European states such as France, Italy, Austria, and Britain announced their neutrality in the war, though Britain worried of Russia acquiring key strategic locations such as the Suez Canal, the Straits, Istanbul, and the Danube. Russia provided the necessary guarantees to them beforehand. The Russians crossed the Danube with a force of 40,000. The only natural obstacle would be the mountains. If the Russians were to successfully pass them, it would be difficult to stop them from reaching Istanbul. The Ottoman Marshal Süleyman Pasha handed the Russians a devastating defeat near the shores of western Thrace, after which Osman Pasha, whose army was half the size of the Russians, gave them an even more humiliating defeat at the field of Pleven. After that, the Russian Tsar himself came to the battle along with the Romanian king. Their number of cannons were 7 times as much as Osman Pasha's. However, they still suffered a defeat after a 12-hour-long attack. Qazi Osman Pasha resisted the Russian forces in Pleven for months and would go down in history as one of the greatest commanders ever to have lived. The arrival of the Russians in Istanbul was only possible after the fall of Pleven. Thousands of soldiers were crushed by cold and starvation during this war. Civilian people were massacred by the Russians. In 1878, the Armistice of Edirne was signed with Russia before they could invade Istanbul. The Ottomans lost a significant amount of territory in the Caucasus. Abdul-Hamid II, whose opinion should have been listened to by the parliament, expressed, "I did not want the war. A number of adventurers wanted it, and they dragged our nation after them. As you see, we are defeated. Our position is clear. Now, the main issue is to take advantage of the competition and remain standing." Meanwhile, there were fierce discussions happening in the post-war parliament. Instead of thinking about the interest of the state by gathering under the umbrella of a single state, members of the parliament adopted a separatist manner, either for their own ambitions or for the groups they represented. In addition, some of them even held the Sultan responsible for the war. After all the disasters that happened, Sultan Abdul-Hamid concluded that constitutional monarchy was not beneficial to the state, and so based on the authority granted to him by the constitutional law, the Sultan closed the parliament and indefinitely took over the administration. Although the constitution was still in effect, the regime of the state reverted to absolute monarchy. In order to alleviate the damages of the war, the Sultan asked for help from Britain. Britain agreed to help in return for a base in Cyprus. This treaty, known as the Istanbul Treaty, would mean the end of the 300 years of Ottoman rule in Cyprus. The Sultan signed this treaty out of desperation. After the Turco-British alliance successfully weakened the Russian position, the great states came together and signed the Treaty of Berlin. This treaty gave away significant amounts of Ottoman territory in the Balkans to various different European states, and the provinces of Montenegro, Romania, and Serbia were given independence from the Ottoman state. During the conference, the French prepared for the invasion of Tunisia. Indeed, after the French troops landed in Tunisia, after the Ottoman governor could not receive the help he needed, he signed a document that left Tunisia's rule to the French. Though the Ottoman rule never recognized the actual status as legal, the 310-year-old Ottoman administration in Tunisia had thus come to an end. At the end of the war, the Ottoman state had suffered a loss of 5.5 million inhabitants and 212,000 square kilometers of land. This does not even include the loss of places such as Tunisia, Cyprus, Bulgaria, and Bosnia. Moreover, the Ottoman state would pay 800 million gold francs in war reparations to Russia, and incur improvements in East Anatolia and regions where the Armenian population was dense, as well as in Macedonia. A new political balance was established in Europe, and especially in the Balkans. The Sultan paid the war compensation through installments, and refrained from implementing the article regarding the improvements in Armenian populated areas and Macedonia for a long time. And according to the Berlin Treaty, 3 independent states emerged in the Balkans, such as Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania. Sultan Abdul-Hamid took the necessary lessons from the catastrophic results of the war with the Russians, which was entered without his will. He would follow a highly cautious and prudent policy throughout his administration and prevent the state from entering another such war. These were the works of Sultan Abdul-Hamid in his first 5 years of rule, from 1876 to 1881. This was part 1 of our series on Sultan Abdul-Hamid II, the last great Ottoman Caliph. If you are new to this channel, please make sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so that you won't miss our upcoming videos. Stay tuned for part 2.